Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today's video is going to be all about how to save a painting that is somewhat turning out to be disastrous, or at least turning out not to be how you were hoping it would look like. I'm sure we've all come across this at some point in time, whether it was a bad color choice or technique choice, and just something is not adding up and turning out very well in the grand scheme of things, and different ways that you can possibly go about fixing that, or at least saving the work that you've already put into your piece of art. Now, this was the epitome of an unplanned video. The piece that I'm working on in this video obviously ended up turning out to be a great example for this video. And I wanted to start off by talking about exactly what I'm working on, because I think in my particular case, it was possibly one of the largest reasons as to why I was having some issues with this particular painting. So this painting was an unplanned piece of art. I originally sketched this up as sort of a last-minute Pride Month piece, which clearly didn't end up happening, and it was so last minute to the point that it was just something that I ended up working on in between waiting to for paint to dry on another piece. And I thought, you know, take this time that I have to wait here and work on something else. So that is what this started out as, and because of that I had really no super set plan in mind. For me at least, a lot of the time I will almost always work on a piece of art once I have already sort of had the super strong image in my head of what I want that piece to look like. And for this was definitely not the case. Pretty much the only set factor was that I knew I wanted it to be much more colorful, which is why I started off with what I call the Selective rainbow color scheme. It's something that I've used in a lot of my paintings. It is obviously colorful, and most people might say rainbow, but it doesn't actually have all of the colors of the rainbow in it. It is a yellow, magenta, purple, tealy blue and dark blue sort of mishmash, so of course it doesn't have any green or red in it. So at this point I really just had the bare minimum of what I vaguely wanted this painting to look like. Wanted it to be colorful, and then at some point I also decided that I wanted to keep the face and sort of immediate hair area actual neutral colors and not bring in that color palette onto their faces, which I have done before, where I've sort of kept everything super colorful. So I knew I wanted there to be more neutral colors in this one. But other than that, I really had nothing, which is ultimately why I decided to start with the super splashy color areas, because I knew I wanted to keep it pretty loose and splashy. I had played around with the idea of inking it first or doing some sort of line work, but I wasn't entirely sure how much I wanted to define, so I figured, you know, that's always something that can be added later. Let's just worry about the color first, since that is the only point that I have actually somewhat decided on at this point, which this part was looking okay. This was not disastrous, really. Like, it was a little out there because I didn't really have a plan, but the looseness and the color blending on everything I was pretty happy with. But I actually, because I was so indecisive about what I was going to do next, it stayed in this state for definitely a few days. I'm not actually sure how many days, which is pretty rare for me. I normally like to sort of bang off paintings as fast as I possibly can, with the added time allowance for paint drying. The other slight issue that I think contributed to this whole sort of catastrophic happening was I'm feeling a little out of practice with watercolor. I've been sort of dabbling into so many other medias that my watercolor, it just feels like it's slipping a bit, and I haven't been using it as regularly, so it just isn't feeling as precise and natural as it has in the past, which I also think contributed to this happening, we shall call it. The main thing I think that ends up being a problem for me lately is actually the dry time. I've been working with so much more dry media lately with pastels and stuff that I just apparently have completely disregarded the idea that things generally go better if you do things in more layers when it comes to watercolor. So I think I've just been working at the individual layers too much and just not allowing them to dry, and I think that could have saved me possibly quite a lot right there. So if you're someone that's using watercolors a lot, just keep that in mind, you know, take your time, wait for layers to dry. It will possibly fix a lot of the issues you might be running into if you just give those paint layers time to dry so you can build up nice layers and not just try and get it all done in one setting. But where the problems really started coming into place was the skin. Now, I don't know why. I think I just wasn't thinking is really what came down to it. The reference photo I was using, which this is somewhat of an Orphan Black piece of fan art, I just want to put that out there because every time I do any sort of fan art, I just do not get to mention it in the video, and then everyone's like, oh, isn't that? And it's like, yes, and I'm just an idiot for not mentioning it. So yes, this is an Orphan Black sort of piece of fan art, but I hope that even if you've never seen that show, you can still appreciate the artwork. I know I do that a lot. Like, there's artwork all of the time that I see that I have like literally no clue what it's from, but I just really like how the piece looks. But anyway, so I think a lot of the second sort of issue that I had where I just was not thinking was the reference picture that I was using had, to be honest, quite terrible lighting, and just the color of the skin. I think I've been doing so much I don't want to say hyperrealism, but I've been way more focused than maybe in the past I had been about just such precise tones in the skin and stuff, and just using those photo references to my full advantage and just really trying to capture a particular scene or whatever. And I think it screwed me over a bit in this case because the lighting and skin tone in the photo that I was using was just terrible, which this is where I feel like it doesn't look terrible right now, but and it might not actually look ever as terrible as it did in person, but the color of the skin on both of them was just awful. And like, it was clearly the paint colors that I was using, and I don't know if it was just me or it was because of the photo, just the skin color was not going to look like skin compared to the super colorful hair. Like, I really needed that to look like a light skin tone, like in natural lighting, without any sort of color shifting that the lighting in the photo was going to give me. Just like really pull off this neutral skin to look like skin and not have some weird color shifting going on because of reference photo lighting. And I completely started off with not doing that. So I was using a lot of naphthalide maroon, which is like a burgundy color, which not a good choice. So when I went into my other layers, I was trying to like really warm things up and get it back to a more natural, neutral skin tone and not these corpse looking skin colors that I had going on originally. And the other problem that started to happen was the lighting on the right side. She's very backlit compared to the person on the left, and I was trying to pull it back a bit. Like, I was trying to not have it as dark toned as the reference photo had with the backlighting. Like, I still wanted to have like all of the highlights and shadows in the appropriate places, but I really wanted to pull back that shadowing really on both of them. The lower halves of their faces were quite dark because of the lighting in the reference photo, and since this was a sort of a surrealistic painting, I really needed to pull that back in so it didn't look strange. So just battling quite a few things here, and just somewhat spoiler alert, I don't think I completely fixed the issues with the watercolor, which is why I sort of jumped around to other medias. And it being watercolor as well was not necessarily helping my situation that much because it is such a translucent medium. I was able to tone up different areas and try and pull that back to a better color, but it just wasn't enough in a lot of places, and so I definitely needed something that had a little more opacity in it. Although I'm sure in some cases the translucency and being able to sort of do those glazes to tone certain areas could be super helpful, it just wasn't in this particular case. And I know this video isn't going to be like a super helpful, like step-by-step thing on how to fix every possible issue that you might come across in a painting that isn't turning out well for you, but I hope that just sort of talking about my thoughts when I was working on this painting and just sort of realizing after the fact what had been going wrong during when I was working on it, that it can help you in some way. I think it is really helpful if you can identify what the problem is in your painting, whether that might be a color issue or lighting issue. Maybe you're not getting enough contrast in your work. At this point, I wasn't super concerned about contrast yet. I knew I was going to have to do a lot of fixing, and at some point I sort of resigned myself to the fact that this probably wasn't going to be staying as a 100% watercolor painting, that I was going to have to add some different medias to sort of fix the areas that were having issues. I know it doesn't look terrible on camera, but just the toning in both faces, like each individual face on their own, it was just, the color and tone in the entire thing was just all over the place. Like the shadows were this crazy purple color that, well, it looked like this crazy purple color when I started to try and warm everything up, and just there were splotchy areas, and I was somewhat overworking every individual layer a little too much, and it just wasn't my best work, we'll put it that way. So once I had resigned myself to the fact that I was going to be adding colored pencils on top of the watercolor, I decided that I was going to just try and tone everything as best I could with the watercolor, just try and get everything as close to the same sort of shade as I could, and just use the watercolor's properties with that possibly smoother blending and subtle transitions between the areas, and then I would fix everything and all the little issues and everything later with colored pencils. So at this point I wasn't super concerned about all of the little details to try and get all of that fixed and in with the watercolor. But before I added the color pencil, I decided that I was going to do a sort of a crazy ink job on the entire thing. I thought a good strategy might have been to really try and make this painting look more graphic and illustration-like, and just those dark, bold lines might not necessarily camouflage all of the issues that I was having with the watercolor and just coloring in general, but it definitely might help to structure the overall image and make things look a little more purposeful and put together. I started with the faces because they were the most straightforward, and like I knew I was just outlining the outside of the face as well as the facial features. I basically just wanted to keep this as outlines, so no cross-hatching or any sort of inking, shading going on. But I did want there to be more line work detail in the hair, so I did quite an extensive amount of line work. I also wanted to keep it fairly messy, so I tried to find the balance. So in the more immediate areas closest to the face, I kept things super structured with a lot of lines, also adding in all of those baby hairs along the side. It was pretty dark, and I knew I wanted to keep the side of the head right here pretty dark, so that's when I started to really go a lot more messy with my line work and just having a lot of fun, honestly, with going back and forth with my dip pen and just sort of smearing it. It is messy, but it's more of a controlled messy because there's a more limited amount of ink on your page, so you're not like fully finger painting, and the acrylic ink dries pretty fast, so you're not just sort of smearing around wet media constantly and it's getting everywhere. it does set pretty fast, which saves possibly quite a lot of mess. But you know, at times artwork is supposed to be messy, so I didn't mind the change of pace with just playing around with the ink and smudging out the different areas that I was gradually adding to the different sections, and I really love the expressive lines that this technique gave me. The black ink also gave me a lot of really nice contrast with all of those lighter and bright colors. And on this left side, I did add a lot more black just to try and create that separation between the head on the hair and the ponytail area sort of coming across. But I didn't want to hide a lot of the bright colors underneath, so I tried to leave some open areas to let that breathe a little so you could see those colors underneath, and so it wasn't just all of a sudden like stark black and then color. And really I was just constantly sort of playing around with that balance between messy and more refined, with the line work that I was adding in with the dip pen, and just how much really detail I wanted to go into in that ponytail area. I did want to keep the outer edges a lot looser than the areas closer to the center and their faces, so just going back and forth with adding some lines, smudging some areas, adding some texture into that ponytail area. At this point, I was really happy with how the ink work was turning out on the left side, and then as soon as I got to the right side, I realized that I was going to have to deal with one of my absolutely just favorite things to have to deal with in a drawing: curly blonde hair. Now, I know you've heard me complain about this in probably far too many videos at this point, but ultimately I was the most concerned about the balancing aspect, because I wanted it to still look like it was light hair, so I didn't want to add a ton of black into the ink work like I did on the left side. So I was kind of freaking out, like, how much actual line work do I put into this thing? Because if you don't add lots of lines into the curly hair strands, it just looks like tentacles, and that's not a good look. So I was sort of freaking out, going back and forth, smudging some things around so that things didn't look super perfect, and I was pretty concerned for the majority of the time that I was working on this right side, because I thought it was possibly like I had this thing that I was really happy with finally of how it was turning out, and then I thought I had just completely decimated any hope at redeeming this piece when I started to add these curly hair strands in. But thankfully I did manage to pull it together, I think, and I was ultimately happy with how this turned out. I tried to fade out the line detail, so there is a lot more detail in the curly hair strands closer to the face, and then I tried to simplify those shapes as you moved further away from the face. So just in general, less line work, try to make it as natural of a transition as possible without there being any sort of definitive point or like you're super noticing the fact that things are getting more open and less detailed the further you move away. But yeah, eventually I was really happy with how this hair was turning out and the structure that the lines were giving, all freehand, which is of course a pretty risky sort of situation. Like, there was a little bit of the pencil lines that I could see underneath, but I really didn't take the time to sort of put in those definitive hair curl structures, so pretty much entirely free-handed, which in and of itself is a pretty risky thing, because if you can very easily mess up when you don't have line work or something to go off of as a sketch base. And I actually decided to go back to the left side and do a little more line detail in that ponytail area, just to again sort of balance the two out. Since there was such extensive line work in the curly hair, I just thought that the left side could use just a little more detail to try and give it more of a cohesive feel. When I had the black ink on this piece, I realized that I could go a little darker in the facial features with some watercolor. I know I could have done it in the colored pencils, but I thought the softness of the watercolor and just the gradual buildup that you can get with the watercolor and it just being literally the same colors that I was previously using was going to be the best possible option. So worked on some final adjustments there, but the main thing that I had debated over for as long as I could essentially put it off without realizing, like, you know, you really should be working on this painting, was the blonde hair, because I really liked how this piece was turning out, and of course my original plan was to have the hair closest to the face be the natural color. So on the left side, perfect, you know, it's really dark brown black hair, just that light gray wash over the upper part where there isn't that much color, perfect, not gonna look strange at all. But in the blonde hair, of course, you know, if you get too close to the blue, it's just going to look green and it's going to look terrible. And I wasn't like super against how the white was looking, but ultimately I did decide to just gradually, super lightly tone that up a little bit just so it wasn't stark white. Definitely it's not as necessarily dark or as blonde with those different highlights. It's a pretty straight wash, just really no depth in it at all. I just went in with like a nice yellow ochre color just so that it wasn't that stark white, and just really watch what happened when I got close to where the blue starts. And ultimately I do think it paid off in the long run. I don't think it looks weird. I think it does look more of like what I was going for than just leaving it white. So overall that was a successful choice. And then it was, of course, on to my final step in the redemption plan, the colored pencils. And for this, I actually didn't use that many colored pencils. I pretty much stuck to my usuals, which if you're interested in, I did an entire video on my most used polychromos pencils, and this definitely stuck to those colors. So I think overall, I pretty much only used about 5 colors, and out of that, it was mostly 3. I did a lot of refining with the ivory pencil just to add back in some highlights more naturally and just lighten up certain areas. They got a bit dark on the right side. And overall, it's just a really nice transition color if I needed to use it for that as well. The other one that I used a lot was cinnamon, just to warm up the areas in the face that still needed it a lot. And also as more of a transition shade, because definitely on the right face, there was a lot of splotchiness and really dark shadowy areas that didn't really fit in, and that pencil helped a lot with that. I did use some darker colors to really boost the depth and shading in some areas, but overall not a lot. Like, this was definitely not necessarily the area that I needed the most help in from the colored pencils. Like I said, it was mostly smoothing out that color palette, adding back in some highlights, and just detailing up the more refined areas like around the eyes, in the ear, all of that kind of stuff. And as my final step to really give a strong boost to some super highlighted areas, I decided to use my favorite white gel pen. I also went over it with a wet brush just to smooth out that pen a little more and also make it a little more subtle in certain areas, and just overall try and make the addition of the gel pen a little more natural looking. And here's the final piece. I hope this video helped you out and gave you some tips and tricks of ways you could possibly help a painting along that maybe isn't turning out the way that you wanted to. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.